Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of your Bish Therapist podcast. My name is Melissa Reich, and I am your Bish Therapist. Today's podcast, I'm going to share with you a little bit of a history of who I am, some of my credentials, giving you a answer to the question, why should I listen to your Bish Therapist podcast? Today, I'm going to tell you why. First, I'm going to start out by giving you a little bit of background on my credentials, sharing a little bit of the Your Bish Therapist podcast origin story. And today, I'm going to talk with you about some major things that are going on in the Bravo universe. To be clear, I am going to cover things outside of Bravo as well. For me, your Bish therapist, I am very interested in a breadth of subjects, true crime, mysteries, pop culture in general. So what I'm going to do today is break down a news story that's been in the Bravoverse. However, each episode is going to be a little bit different. Some of them may have something to do with Bravo and some of them may not. Also, to be clear, those of you who are listening to this right now, this is my podcast. However, I am also recording video. So you can find the full podcast video on YouTube. The channel is Your Bish Therapist. You can just search that and find me on YouTube. The reason for both shows, essentially, is that I make a lot of really interesting facial expressions and I liberally use my hands. When I talk, I gesture with my hands. That's just kind of how I am. I'm Italian and this is just who I am. So for those of you who are just interested in the audio, great, no problem. If you'd also like to see a video, head over to YouTube, Your Bish Therapist podcast, and you'll be able to see me there. So let me start out by introducing myself. Again, my name is Melissa Reich. I am a real life therapist. What does that mean? I have my master's degree in clinical psychology from LaSalle University. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from Penn State. And I am licensed in the state of Pennsylvania, which is where I live currently. I am happy to have an episode where I talk about licensing and the whole process. I've had a lot of therapists reach out to me, which I really have loved. So, my goal is to essentially make this podcast whatever it is that you all want to hear. For me, a big part of that is feedback is very important. So at the end of this podcast, I'm going to list some of my contact information, some ways to share some of your feedback, and, maybe even I can take some questions and things like that, but I'll address that in a bit. So the first thing I want to share is with my history as a therapist, I have been in the field for about 17 years. I've worked in a lot of different milieus. I've worked in inpatient addiction treatment. I've worked in outpatient addiction treatment. I've worked with gambling addiction. I've been a gambling prevention specialist. I've done some teaching. I've done private practice. So I really have run the gamut in my career of, doing a lot of things, which has helped me gain a lot of clinical knowledge and perspective on a lot of different topics. I'm also a hardcore Bravoholic since, kind of day one. And I thought, why not combine my two loves of therapy and clinical interpretation and reality TV? Because Lord knows there is a lot to interpret on reality TV, especially on Bravo. Lots to interpret. My goal here is not to be rude or snarky. My goal is to provide true information. And if we can use something in the reality TV zeitgeist to help us. I think that, that's my goal. To how can I make something good out of this dumpster fire that we call reality TV? So that's where I come in. Now, that being said, I am also human. I have a wickedly dark sense of humor. I have a big personality. And sometimes I may, make some jokes or say some shady things. But, that's just me being an imperfect human. Um, but the general goal is to use this as an outlet for learning and growth and support and awareness. So the your Bish therapist name comes from the wonderful and beautiful Amy Phillips. Amy Phillips, if you have not heard of her, she has an amazing podcast called Drama Darlings, which is on Patreon. I highly recommend people check that out if you haven't already. So Amy used to call herself your bitch wife, and that came from an episode of Real Housewives of New Jersey where Joe Giudice says that about Teresa, his wife at the time. And, being a therapist, I had DM'd Amy one day and I just joked that I was her bitch therapist. And so that's kind of how the name came to be. Now, what I'll say is cursing isn't supported on a lot of platforms, especially in your name and your handle. So I just made it more user friendly. So I changed it to your Bish therapist. And that is where the name comes from. And from that was born the idea of a YBT podcast. And, side note here, I am a huge YMH fan. People who are listening to this, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just ignore it. And if you do, please DM me on Instagram because I'm a huge YMH fan. And, I just thought YBT was such a good abbreviation for your Bish therapist. So an homage to the great YMH studios. Here's what you can expect today. I'm going to discuss two things today. Today, we're going to talk about Bethenny Frankel's, I'm not sure what to call it, her revolt against Bravo TV and reality TV in general, and Carol Radziwill. Now, the reason I'm going to discuss both of these issues is because for anyone who hasn't heard, Bethenny is starting a revolution. She is calling Bravo, specifically Andy Cohen, Bravo as a whole, she's calling them to task, claiming Bravo exploits women specifically. And there's a whole lot of other accusations and claims, right? That there is, inappropriate behavior going on behind the scenes, encouraging women to drink when they don't want to drink. A lot of information about personal misconduct. And I will tell you right now, probably all of my episodes are going to have a trigger warning because while there's a group of people that think trigger warnings are somehow lame or stupid, as a therapist, being triggered is a very real experience and I don't take it lightly. So a lot of my podcasts are going to cover some challenging topics. For example, abuse, sexual abuse, child abuse, things like that. So for me, I just want everyone to know right out of the gate, at any point, I will give you a warning before I start discussing those things. But going back to Bethenny, part of what she's alleging is, sexual misconduct behind the scenes and not being handled properly by Bravo. There's the whole Real Housewives Ultimate Girls Trip brouhaha, which is, Brandy did something to Caroline Manzo and, HR had to get involved. And, now we're not going to see Real Housewives Ultimate Girls Trip. I don't think we're going to see it ever. But they say we'll see it next year. So I guess to be determined there. But we can't forget Bravo is a huge corporation. When Housewives started, it's nothing like it was now. Let's not forget the Real Housewives of Orange County. The first season was wonderful. It was skytops and tennis and lunching and silliness. And, now it's kind of turned into a different animal. So what I'm going to do for you is kind of break down what I'm hearing from Bethenny. Carol kind of forced herself into that mix, which is really interesting. So I'm going to comment on that. And, and then at the end, I'll share a little bit about, plans for the podcast, where you can find me, all that good stuff. So here, let me say this first and foremost. I am a strong ally for all marginalized groups and communities. And in general, I'm just an advocate for human rights. I need to say that first and foremost. So to me, Bravo exploiting women is not news. That's their model. And, I say that, people will say, well, they get paid and, they get a lot of benefits and gains and things like that. Well, of course. But some of the things that Bethenny has brought to light has been, very eye-opening. And I understand people have a lot of different feelings about it. But from my perspective, let's take Bethenny out of it just for a second. If human rights are being trampled, then I am here for a revolution. I think that historically, revolutions come from people being mistreated, marginalized groups and communities, and, people have enough of it, and then they speak up and things change. And I think that is really, really important. If the women who are signing up for these shows, or the men and the families, and keeping in mind gender fluidity and all those things, although I don't think Bravo necessarily represents that, but that's a whole other story. From what I understand, people are signing their life away. An important key term here is in perpetuity. So in perpetuity, what that means is, it's a fancy way to say forever, like old Sandlot, forever. Okay. If you're young, you may not get that reference, but Sandlot rules. So these women are signing, away the rights for their images to be used, even in AI. And, that speaks to a little bit of like the SAG-AFTRA, the current, hubbub around that, and, the protesting, and then them holding, movie studios and people accountable. I'm here for all of it. I think that if people are being creative and using their qualities to create content, then that needs to be properly respected. People need to be paid properly, and they need to be treated properly. And basic human rights are very important. Now, what people are frustrated about with Bethenny is the fact that she tends to be very contradictory. So what I saw today, as I record this podcast, is that Bethenny had pitched a show to Bravo a couple months before this revolution. And, people are really up in arms about that, which I understand. I think the thing of it is that let's not get lost in Bethenny's stuff and forget what this is actually about. I also find it interesting that, so Carol Radziwill, who, for those of you who don't remember, she and Bethenny were great friends on Rhody, and best friends, in fact. They traveled together, they, spent summers together, they did all these things together, and then all of a sudden we see the relationship deteriorate, and everyone kind of wanted them to come back together, but at the end of the day, it just seemed like they were two fundamentally different people, which it always fascinated me. That dynamic always fascinated me. We've all been friends with people that, we kind of maybe take a step back from and say, what was this about for me? I don't know if this was healthy, etc. But nevertheless, they were friends. So I think for Carol now to come out and just completely try to destroy Bethenny yet again in the media, what does that say about her? Because again, I think that Carol is getting too swept up into the Bethenny of it all. Like Bethenny and the change that needs to happen aren't one entity. Yes, Bethenny is leading the charge for sure, but she isn't the charge, if that makes sense. So let's not get it twisted. There have also been rumors that Bethenny is bringing Rachel Leviss into the fold in her fight against, Bravo. I've seen a lot of different articles about this and stories about this and things like that. And again, here's what I'll say. Rachel Leviss, people may not like her, right? She did some really crappy stuff, for sure. No doubt about it. But at this point, she's a human being who her demise was filmed and used for sensationalism, right? I mean, for entertainment. Everyone in the cast was. And, I read something about she wanted to come back, but she wanted Bravo to cover the extensive cost of her mental health treatment, which, by the way, I will say that mental health treatment in this country, healthcare in general, is abysmal. We all should have access to great healthcare that shouldn't cost us a fortune or our entire house or our lives or what have you. I think it's absolutely gross. And if Bravo used her for their purposes, I do believe they should have assisted with funding her mental health treatment. So, my concern here is that change is upon us, and change can be a beautiful thing, but it also can be really scary. And I believe that Housewives as we know it is over. This whole crusade is, if done right, the goal is to change the entire landscape of Bravo and reality TV. What is that going to look like? None of us know. So while I'm here for it, I also understand, the concerns. I also think that Bethenny, can be contradictory and very confusing for a lot of people, myself included. But at the end of the day, my stance is that if human rights are being trampled, then we really need to do a better job here. Going back to Carol for a second. So she went on Heather McDonald's Juicy Scoop podcast, and I am a proud Juicy Scooper, so I listened to that. I just couldn't help but feel that her words were so reactive. It still sounds like she's so angry at Bethenny and upset. And, all those things are fine. But to me, it undercuts a little bit of her message. It kind of just seems a little bit bullying, mean girl, what have you. Carol, here's the funny thing about Carol. I always liked her on the show. I think she's smart. I think she's accomplished. I think she's a, badass woman. Bethenny too. They both have similar characteristics, to be honest. But what I don't like is for people who don't have a good clinical understanding of some terms like toxic narcissist. Carol was just really throwing out a lot of buzzwords, gaslighter, toxic narcissist. I'm trying to think of other things that she said. She was just really unkind. And here's the thing. I look at characteristics like narcissism on a continuum. Okay. So over here on the one side of the continuum is, very little amount. And over here on the other side of the continuum is a really significant amount. Most people fall somewhere in the middle. This is personally just how I practice. I've heard a lot about toxic narcissism and covert and this and that. To me, that's a bunch of fancy worded ways to talk about this topic. The fact of the matter is that we all have narcissistic traits and qualities. All of us do, myself included. It's just part of this thing we call being human. So everyone falls on the spectrum. And I think when people talk about these different types of narcissism or toxic narcissism, it really, for me as a clinician, it's off-putting because it just seems like people are trying to use these buzzwords for clout. And, although I love Carol, she's a writer, she's really smart. She's not a therapist. She's not a psychologist. She's not a psychiatrist. So that is something that, I didn't love hearing. Also Carol kind of called out Bethenny for doing things that she also does or has done. In fact, I don't know if anyone caught this, but there was one point in the interview where Carol said to Heather, just so you know, I'm the person who started this. It was some topic. I can't remember what it was, but she said, just so you know, I'm the Bravo housewife who brought this to light. But then immediately shaded Bethenny for thinking that she's the one who introduces things to people. So it was just really contradictory. And, I'll be clear too, as a clinician, I love these housewives and I love these people, but I'm also human and I don't stan anybody. I think all humans are imperfect, and these people are just humans. They're famous humans, but they're just human beings. So I don't often stan a housewife, and whether I like you or not, I'm going to call some stuff out. That's just how I roll. So I would love to know your thoughts about this. So this will lead me to my contact information, which is, and here's the thing, I'm hesitant because I do not want this contact information to be abused. So what I will share is the contact information and then some disclaimers with it. So you can find me on Instagram at Your Bish Therapist. I'm also on TikTok and YouTube, Your Bish Therapist. Now, I have an email that I set up specifically for this podcast, yourbishtherapist@gmail.com. I am very interested in building community, and I am so appreciative to the people who are supportive of me on Instagram and things like that. What I will say is that legally, I cannot provide any clinical help, feedback, or, I can't practice. So I've had some DMs and some people reaching out to me for specific help. Legally, I cannot assist in that way, but I will always help people get to the resources that they need to resolve whatever issue that they're having. So keep in mind with the email, I cannot answer personal, questions or concerns, but generally, anything else is on the table. I'd love to hear what you would like me to cover. I'm open to, I'm just open to seeing where this podcast goes. I'm very flexible and I'm very passionate and I'm very excited. So sky's the limit, for me. The other disclaimer that I want to share is that, and I'm going to share this at the top of all my podcasts, but I am a clinician who I am not treating these people as clients. I don't know them. I am assessing I cannot properly assess them because I don't know them. They're not my client. But what I am doing is observing behaviors in the media and providing a clinical interpretation based on my observations and based on my history of working maybe with some people with similar issues. So let's just keep that in mind. The last thing that I will say as I wrap up episode 1 of my podcast is just thank you to those of you who are listening, to those of you who have really supported me, and for those of you who are new listeners, and thank you. I appreciate you very, very much. I am just a regular person who all I ever wanted to be was a therapist. And during the pandemic, I unfortunately was dealing with cancer, and I had to start undergoing treatment during the pandemic, which was a blood-soaked nightmare. But I had to take a step back from private practice, and it was really hard for me because this is all I ever wanted to do. And so for this opportunity to just kind of fall in my lap, I feel really grateful and excited, and I'm just really grateful and thankful for everyone listening and for all the support. It just means the world to me. So for today, this is going to be the end of my podcast, but my plans are I will be releasing one podcast a week. For now, I think I'm going to do about 25 to 30 minutes. But if you guys want more, I'm happy to do more. I'm also happy to do it more frequently. But for now, it'll be once a week, and it'll be released every Tuesday. You heard it here first. So you can find your Bish Therapist podcast anywhere that you listen to podcasts: Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, wherever you can find a podcast. I will also post about it on my Instagram account and have links. So if you're having trouble finding anything, you can head over to your Bish Therapist on Instagram, and I will have everything posted for you there. So until next time, thank you so much. Take care.